fortunate to get Professor N.R. Bhanumurthy, Bhanumurthy, Vice Chancellor of Ambedkar School of Economics, University, Bangalore. Formerly, he was a professor at National Institute of Public Finance, New Delhi. He has working experience in the Institute of Economic Growth, New Delhi. He was also visiting fellow in ADB, UN, World Bank, and other reputed institutions. He has a number of articles related to macroeconomics and public finance, and is also a recipient of PC Mahalanobis Award, V.K. Rao Award. So we are fortunate to get him for today evening, and he will be talking to us on macro-fiscal issues in India. So, sir, on behalf of Center for Budget Studies, I'm Hari Kumar. Welcome you to this session. So we have students from the MSc Economics and Financial Technology, then some students from MA Applied Economics, and also some faculty members from other colleges are also attending this meeting. So on behalf of all of us, I extend a warm welcome to you, sir. You can talk it for 40-45 minutes, followed by some queries and discussion. Thank you very much. So let us start.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Hari Kumar. First of all, can you hear me?
Yeah, definitely can.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank Center for Budget Studies, CUST, for inviting me to this talk. I've been asked to speak on macro-fiscal issues that is emerging in India right now. And, it's a very important topic for a simple reason that, whatever happening in the last 2 years has actually brought a lot of instability in the overall macro-fiscal, relationships. And, the pressure on the fiscal is actually increasing day by day. And at the same time, the COVID-19 is also still lingering on our heads. We do see that some cases are increasing in some parts of the country, and then, more or less, the world economy is not completely out of the COVID-19 issue. And what's happening in China and other parts of the advanced countries suggests that we still have to be a little more cautious than what we are right now. And I don't know how many students in the class are still wearing the mask. I can see the class, but I'm not sure how many still are wearing the mask. Even if your teachers don't wear, please you wear the mask. I think that's very important. I'm sitting alone in my room, so I removed my mask. Otherwise, I won't be taking my mask. With that, let me get into topic of my lecture. So I've been working on this macro-fiscal issues for almost maybe 12-13 years, contributing to the successive finance commissions from 13th Finance Commission to 14th as well as 15th Finance Commission. But please pardon me if I have a completely different take on what is the macro-fiscal framework right now and what need to be done. Because I do find that some of the views that I have is actually not popular in the general discussions. So let me go to my PPT directly. Can I share the PPT?
Okay.
Yeah. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. So post-COVID India, as I said, macro-fiscal issues have become an extremely important. Rather, it has a major role in addressing how the Indian economy is going to come out of this the COVID-19 slowdown, and not only in terms of growth, but also in terms of the overall, lives and livelihoods. I think that is a big challenge during the COVID, and but it become much more challenging in the post-COVID period. So we have seen some of the stylish facts that I'm just presenting here. If you look at the way the COVID-19 has affected India, in the year 2019, as a 2021, we have seen that GDP growth has declined by more than 6%, I think somewhere close to 6.6%. But then we have seen kind of a very sharp recovery in 2021, 22, and then we are actually recovering right now at 8.9% in the last year. And then there are a lot of forecasts are suggesting that even for the current year, that is 22-23, we'll be somewhere close to so 7 to 7.5%, and I think it's a very decent growth, especially when we are coming out of the COVID-19. The kind of loss, the kind of GDP loss that we had during the COVID period, in my view, is more of a permanent loss. Although RBI report 2 days back, RBI has released the report on currency and finance, and where it says that you will get back to the pre-COVID situation only after 15 years. I think the students of economics or statistics can easily understand what it means is that we will overcome the trend growth, if not for the COVID. We will overcome. Actually, we will be growing much more than the pre-COVID situation. Then only we can actually cross the pre-COVID kind of a trend line. So that it's in my view, it's not a bad news. I think it's a good news that post-COVID trend growth is going to be slightly higher than the pre-COVID trend growth. Then only you can see that the two lines crisscrossing after 15 years. So I think the RBI report is making a very optimistic assumption, presentation that the post-COVID trend growth is going to be slightly better than the pre-COVID trend growth. So the recovery happening in only the commodity producing sectors. That is, when I say commodity producing sectors, it is basically agriculture and industry. And but services appears to be taking a little more time than the commodity producing sectors, because service sector is mostly contact intensive sectors, and I think Kerala depends very heavily on the service industry. So I think Kerala might take a little more time in recovering compared to other states where the service sector becomes the most the commodity producing sector becomes a some kind of a balanced growth is there in terms of agriculture and industries. So then there are a lot of questions have been raised that 8.19% growth that we have seen in 2021-22 was based on the base effect, because the previous year it was minus 6.6%. Right now we are growing at 8.9%, and many observers said that it's more of due to base effect. I think it's partly true, but I think in my personal view, I think it's going to be, the recovery is going to be on a durable basis, not certainly kind of a just because of the base impact we are seeing this 8.9%. But I think in my view it is more of a the recovery seems to be on a slightly on a structural it's a structural kind of a recovery, and I do think that going forward we will be somewhere close to 7 to 7.5%. But most importantly, which is more relevant for this topic, is that COVID-19 has actually put a huge pressure on the overall macroeconomic policy, that is fiscal and monetary policies. Although, as we know very well, that the fiscal policy had a very limited space to address some kind of a shocks like this. As I'm sure the students know that the GDP slowdown, GDP growth slowdown actually happening even before the COVID hit us. Similarly, I think the fiscal policy constraint also started with the slowdown in the GDP growth that started from 2016-17 onwards. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that the slowdown in the GDP growth and also the tightness in the fiscal and monetary policies was certainly there even before the COVID actually hit us. So given that when the COVID-19 happened, there was very limited space for the policy response, and I'm sure in the last 2 years, whatever the policy intervention that happened, we know what all the kind of intervention that may happen. So we have seen, there was something called Atmanirbhar Bharat. I'll come to that a little later. But then most of the economies actually demanded for a large fiscal stimulus, and almost similar to what governments have provided during global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And on the hindsight, we know now that the kind of fiscal stimulus that was being given in the post-global financial crisis was unwarranted, and because of that, we have seen a very high inflation pressure that Indian economy has experienced for more than 2 years. Those who track the Indian economy, they will tell you that post-global financial crisis, we have had double-digit inflation for more than 2 years. I think somewhere close to 13 or 13.5% inflation in 2011, 12, and 12 and 13. So I think this time around, in my view, the government seems to learned a lesson of the global financial crisis. And despite there was a huge fiscal stimulus demand, the governments have actually been very hesitant, especially the fiscal policy was very hesitant. In fact, this time around, monetary policy was being made very active, and I'm sure all of you know that the monetary policy response to COVID-19 happened even before the central government started implementing the lockdown in the month of March 2020. So, in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that we had a fiscal crisis even before COVID-19 hit us, and the only space available at that point of time was the monetary policy. And I think the monetary policy has played a very, very important role. And we know that they brought down interest rates, they increase the liquidity in the economy. So there are many things that they have done. In fact, 70 to 80% of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, where I think totally it's estimated to be something like 30 lakh crore. So the 30 lakh, out of 30 lakh crore, 62 or 70%, certainly 70% has been contributed by the monetary policy. And I think that certainly seems to have played a major role in containing the adverse impact of the COVID-19 on overall Indian economy. And on the other hand, if you look at the fiscal deficit numbers for 2021, for 21-22, and also for the 22-23 budgeted numbers, I think all of us should be very clear that nearly 30% of the fiscal deficit has been allowed to has been we have accepted almost 30% fiscal deficit in the last 3 years. If you add both center and state together, the fiscal deficit every year was nothing less than 10%. So those who think that governments have not done anything in terms of supporting the economy, I think they may have to really rethink on that, especially when I say this, for the past 3 years, including the current year, the fiscal deficit or the general government deficit would be somewhere above 10% per annum. And so it has been happening for the last 3 years. So the fiscal support and the fiscal policy, if not directly, but there are indirect intervention, and that certainly seems to have led to large fiscal deficit of close to 30% in the last 3 years. So all these things seems to suggest that the recovery that we are seeing right now, in my view, is on a durable basis, and I'm sure the students will be knowing there's a lot of discussion about whether the recovery is going to be V-shaped recovery. Somebody talked about K-shaped recovery, somebody talked about U-shaped, somebody talked about W-shaped. So I think is more or less, in my view, you don't need to believe me, but you can take any indicator, any macro indicator or any finance indicator. You can simply plot the graph and say what kind of shape it is going to be there. And I'm sure almost at least 90% of the variables will suggest you that it is a V-shaped recovery. Okay, I'm talking about the data that we have right now. So if you look at any kind of macro data, just plot it, and you will not be surprised to see a V-shaped recovery in almost all the indicators. Okay, so and later what happened is what we are seeing right now, again for the past 1 week or maybe almost a month now, there's a lot of discussion about rising inflation, and the inflation has actually spiked to 6.95% in the month of March, and there are a lot of concern that we might see some kind of a runaway inflation, as the way we have seen in the post global financial crisis. And uh, but I think what is more important is how we are going to see that what kind of inflation that we are going to see in the next a quarter or 2 quarters. I think that's going to be very crucial, and we have already seen the Reserve Bank of India hiking the interest rates for the first time after almost 4 years by 40 basis points, basically to address a rising inflationary concerns. But I have a different take on this. I do believe that the inflation of 6.95%, in my view, we almost peaked in a sense. I'm sure it will be somewhere close to 7%. We would have peaked in terms of inflation, and for April, May, there is no data available for the last year. We are not sure what kind of a data that they are going to consider for April, May. But come June, I think my own expectation is that the inflation would be somewhere just close to 7%. It cannot be a runaway inflation that many analysts are actually talking about. So I have various reasons why I think the inflation is actually peaked. But if anybody wants to know, during the Q&A, they can ask me. I can explain why I think that inflation is actually peaked. There are also a lot of discussions about India entering stagflation. Again, I don't think that India is anywhere near stagflationary condition. When I say stagflation, again, students, I'm sure all of you know what is meant by stagflation. Stagflation is nothing but stagnation plus inflation. That means the GDP growth will be flat when there is no rise in the GDP growth, and we are going to see a kind of a runaway inflation. So I certainly don't see that, because even an institution which is critical to the government is actually predicting the GDP growth of somewhere close to 7.5% for the current year. So even if you assume that inflation is at 7% for the whole year, I certainly don't think that condition is called stagflationary condition. So I hope and I believe that India is really not entering the stagflationary condition. Rather, if you just compare this with the United States, where the tolerable level of inflation for the United States is just about 1.5% to 2%. Like, they also follow inflation targeting regime, and they have inflation target around 1.5 and 2%. So there right now the inflation is 8%. Okay, and the GDP growth is somewhere close to 2%. So that one can say that you are somewhere getting close to stagflationary condition. But in our case, in Indian context, our tolerable level of inflation on the upper side is around 6%. So we are just experiencing an inflation of somewhere close to 7%. So and this is despite Ukraine-Russian war, which has created some kind of instability in the oil markets, which led to larger oil prices. So given that kind of scenario, 7%, I don't think it's a big number, but I do hope that it will not go to cross that 7% in a big way. There could be some slippage on the 7%, but it cannot be a large slippage in terms of the inflation rate. So My take is that India is not entering into stagflationary condition. Rather, we should be recovering much stronger way than other countries. And I think the tag of India being the fastest growing large economy in the world, I am sure we will be able to manage to hold it for some more time, especially when China is actually slowing down. So in that sense, our macro policies have certainly helped in a big way. But I think there are other medium-term to long-term concerns when it comes to fiscal policy. Whether are we able to manage, the 5 trillion economy that the government of India is talking about, or the 10 trillion economy that by 2030 that the government is actually trying to focus. So all those issues we need to really discuss and see what kind of fiscal policy that one needs to uh, have to achieve that kind of a medium term to long term goals. So we have a multi policy framework. Again, I thought I'll just put it because since I'm talking to students, I thought let me put up some of the basic things. Um, so I think in your Indian economy, you would have read that India has adopted what is called Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act in 2003, which says that the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP should be close to equal to 3% for the central government, and revenue deficit should be equal to zero. And then the public debt to GDP for both center plus states should be somewhere close to 60%. So the first two targets, the fiscal deficit and revenue deficit, is almost same for center and states. The public debt target of 60% for center plus states. In fact, the Dr. N.K. Singh committee says that the center should hold 40% public debt, and while the state should hold 20% public debt. That's how the 60% is coming down. And this act was adopted by the center as well as all the states. However, what happened is there was a regular slippage in the targets by the central government, but on the other hand, the center has tried to force the state governments to adopt these FRBM targets in a very stringent manner, while the center was always postponing their goals. In fact, they extended the goal post all the time, except in 2007-8, where the central government has actually achieved that FRBM target. And now, but most importantly, what they have done, the central government in 2018, and they have they amended the FRBM Act, and what they did was they removed what is that called, this second target, that revenue deficit should be equal to zero. That target they have removed, and they only retained the fiscal deficit target of 3% and the public debt target of 40% for the central government, but then they removed the revenue deficit target. And those who understand the difference between the fiscal deficit and revenue deficit, I think I need to give a little bit of explanation here. When you say revenue deficit should be equal to zero, that means you should not be borrowing for consumption purpose. Okay, revenue deficit is nothing but difference between revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. So you should not borrow for revenue expenditure purposes. So you have to manage your revenue expenditure within your revenue receipts, and the fiscal deficit should be brought down to 3%. That means the difference between fiscal deficit and revenue deficit is government capital expenditure or the public investment. So the public investment should be at 3%, per annum. So that's what the FRBM Act is saying. So any borrowing that you do to cover up the fiscal deficit should actually get into the asset creation, that is public investment uh, expenditure. So, and there is also a lot of misconception with regard to the FRBM Act. Many believe that FRBM is basically an expenditure compression mechanism. I mean, reducing the size of the government expenditure. But those who have been working on this FRBM, I would like to say that FRBM Act is not an expenditure compression mechanism. Rather, it is an expenditure switching mechanism from revenue expenditure to capital expenditure. So FRBM, again, I want to reiterate and repeat that FRBM is not an expenditure compression mechanism. Rather, it is an expenditure switching mechanism from revenue expenditure to capital expenditure for obvious reason that capital expenditure is supposed to be more superior compared to the revenue expenditure, and and that's how you get a larger growth. Otherwise you end up with larger inflation. So that is why we need to really give a lot of respect to FRBM Act, and I think it did very well. When I said that we have achieved in 2007-8, I think it's a very important point that it started in 2003 and then we tried to achieve that goals in 2007-8, and I think that is a 3 or 4 years or 5 years for that matter was the golden era of Indian economy, where we have seen a very long, very high GDP growth, historically high GDP growth during that period, and large part of it happened because of bringing down the revenue deficit to zero in 2007-8, and that's how we could overcome, even the global financial crisis, if not for a reckless fiscal stimulus that has been adopted in the post-global financial crisis period, which led to sorry, which led to a larger inflation. Okay, and as I said, in 2008 finance bill, when they amended the FRBM Act, government of India has dropped the revenue deficit target. What it means is that even if when you're dropping the revenue deficit target of zero, if you're running the fiscal deficit of 3%, that means all the 3% can actually be there for the revenue deficit or revenue expenditure. So that means by dropping this, you're losing that whole principle of FRBM. When I said it's an expenditure switching mechanism, now when you're dropping this target of revenue deficit, it might end up in forcing the government to borrow almost 3% of GDP for consumption purpose, which could lead to inflationary pressure in the economy. So I think that I think we need to really keep in mind. And on the other hand, this amendment was not really done for the states. States were asked to follow the original FRBM Act, but the relaxation is only done for the central government, which I think is not a expansionary policy. Rather, it would have its implications on the GDP growth. In 15th Finance Commission made the FRBM estimations, but then for the first time, a commission says there are indicative recommendations and is not really forced on the central government. Because of that, it is very indicative. The center is yet to formulate the new FRBM Act, which, in the absence of that kind of a medium-term fiscal framework, it will create some kind of a risk on the macro-fiscal balance in the next 4 to 5 years. So that I think that we are only hoping that central government would come out with a new FRBM, which is more relevant for current Indian context. So those who this is one of my favorite graphs. So here again there is no econometrics. There is no some school of thought, the Keynesian or this, that. So what I just did was you just plotted 4 time series data on fiscal deficit. These are all for central government. Now you'll see that there is a fiscal deficit, revenue deficit. Actually, this is public capital expenditure. This is capital investment data, and then private investment data. So we have plotted all the 4 graphs, and there's, as I said, I just want to repeat, I didn't do anything, just to plot this series. And now you see what happened. I told you in 2007-8, India has achieved the revenue deficit target of 0%, and this is the same period where the fiscal deficit and government capital expenditure, they both are same, somewhere close to 4%. So the fiscal deficit for 4%, and all the fiscal deficit is actually going for capital expenditure purpose, and that is the time where the revenue deficit was zero. And this has actually happened from 2003-4, when I said that FRBM Act was enacted, and from 2003-4, where the revenue deficit was above 5%, that actually gradually has been brought down to 0%, and which has actually led to reduction in the overall fiscal deficit also, which was somewhere close to almost 9% in 2003-4, which was brought down to 4%, and public investment, which was somewhere close to 3%, has actually brought up to 4%. So in a sense, for 3 or 4 consecutive years, the public investment was 3% and above. In that, that's what I said. This is the golden period of the Indian economy, and the large part of that was being contributed by declining the revenue deficit or the brought down. That is the only the policy intervention that was adopted at that point of time, where the revenue deficit was brought down to 0% in 2007-8. And the most important part of it is that you will see this private investment data. Now, the private investment data since the adoption of FRBM Act has gone from 20% here to 30% within the span of 4 years. Am I right? So it has gone up from 20% in 2003-4 to 30%, close to 30% in 2007-8. That is between 4 years. The private investment rate has actually increased by 10 percentage points as a ratio to GDP. And if I say that the private investment and the revenue deficit were mirror images, right? When the revenue deficit is actually brought down to zero, we see that the private investment is actually peaked. So in a sense, this is what we call it as crowding out impact, right? The crowding out impact of revenue deficit. So lower the revenue deficit, higher the private investment, and higher the revenue deficit, it is the lower the private investment. So the post-global financial crisis, this is the period of global financial crisis. Suddenly, the revenue deficit has gone up to 5%. It has crossed more than 5%. In 2009-10, our fiscal deficit was 10%. The reason why I'm telling all these things is that now in this COVID crisis, we have not got into this kind of a exuberant kind of a policy. Rather, we have gone to increase this, capital expenditure, assuming that the private investment also crowds in the economy. So I think we have learned a lot of lessons here, and I think right now the focus seems to be heavily on government capital expenditure. And those who are tracking the Indian budgets, last 2 years budgets are heavily focused on public investment, and I think that seems to be the major lesson that we learned from the global financial crisis. Okay. So now we had this, as I started by saying that fiscal situation deteriorated even before the COVID-19, and the recent crisis, actually the COVID crisis actually brought back the role of fiscal policy in reviving the aggregate demand, which has actually collapsed due to not only due to COVID, but also due to the stringent lockdowns that was introduced in the first quarter of 2021. So a lot of fiscal stimulus measures have been introduced, not necessarily a direct fiscal stimulus measures. Of course, there are the Food Security Act and all those things that have been brought in. But then there are a lot of indirect fiscal stimulus measures that have been given. Not many people, think that there are fiscal stimulus, but so the fiscal stimulus need not lead to fiscal deficits all the time. I think if somebody wants to write it, I'll be happy to repeat again. The fiscal stimulus need not lead to fiscal deficits all the time. Okay, and the kind of fiscal stimulus that was provided as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat actually doesn't lead to fiscal deficit. Rather, it is actually leading to large public debt component, and I think that that needs to be appreciated without putting any heavy pressure on the fiscal. The policies that have been introduced was only going to lead to a larger public debt component, and they have given a lot of credit guarantee loans to MSME, then to many other what is that, agriculture sector, housing. There are a lot of credit guarantee loans have been provided, and so the guarantee part of it will actually come into public debt. It doesn't really need to come into the annual fiscal deficit, that estimations. So the questions have been raised. Will it have some similarity with post 2008 crisis? As I said, since I've been arguing this, we are not going to see a kind of a post 2008 crisis kind of situation. We are slightly different this time, and in fact, a lot of questions have been raised about the fiscal policy. Are there limits to fiscal deficits, and whether the quality of expenditure matter, whether which one you should target, whether you need to target deficits or whether you need to target debt. So I just wanted to bring one important aspect in the whole fiscal policy debate in this country, which I find it very, very uncomfortable or unhappy with, is that most of the fiscal policy discussions and debates in this country is actually only on how much money has been allocated and what is the fiscal deficit, what is the tax and all those things. But one important macro fiscal indicator which doesn't get really discussed, but I think that is the most important, even more than fiscal deficit or the GDP growth, is the public debt to GDP ratio. I think that variable doesn't get discussed much in neither in the classroom nor in the public policy circles, and any kind of research. We don't really focus much on public debt to GDP ratio. In my view, for me, the one number which all of us, not just live alone the economists or the economic students or the economic policymakers, I think every citizen of this country should remember is the public debt to GDP ratio. If you don't remember it, we will end up in the country next to Kerala, which is Sri Lanka. What happened to Sri Lanka? I mean, nobody thought within a span of 1 month or 2 months, they end up in this kind of misery where most of the time there was a neglect of what kind of public debt building up happening in the country. And I think they're facing a severe crisis. And of course, I'm not saying that we'll end up there, but I'm saying we need to really focus on uh, one variable, that is public debt to GDP ratio. And that is one which relates, which links not only the macro and fiscal, but also the monetary policy. So when we talk about the macro fiscal, we cannot keep the monetary policy away. And I think for all these things, it is the public debt to GDP ratio. And those who have been thinking why the central bank has not increased the interest rate for the past 2 months or 3 months when the inflation pressure was building up. One concern was that any increase in the interest rates will actually have a heavy pressure on the fiscal through increase in the interest payments. Where the public debt to GDP ratio has actually gone up to more than 90% now. Okay, the FRB max saying you have to bring down the public debt to GDP ratio to 60%. But actually, what you're seeing, we are seeing the reverse of it. It is increasing every year. Even before the COVID-19, it was somewhere close to 70%. Now, the post-COVID, we are seeing that public debt to GDP ratio has actually increased to somewhere close to 92 or 93%. So, the financing or servicing that public debt is something is going to be a big task for not only for the central government, but even for state governments. I think states like Kerala and the other states are actually facing a lot of constraints in financing, servicing the public debt of the states. In fact, the new state that added right now is Andhra Pradesh, right? The recent period, Andhra Pradesh also has done very what we call loose fiscal policy, and I think they are ending up in running a very heavy public debt to GDP ratio, which they cannot be able to manage. So I think public debt is something becomes very important. Those who are students, those who are listening to me, actually, you start looking at the public debt to GDP ratio data, not only for the central government but also for the state governments. Then only you know what's happening. So when I say public debt to GDP ratio, it's a ratio, right? Yeah, there is a in the numerator you have public debt component, and the denominator you have a GDP, right? So the public debt to GDP ratio declines. When will it decline? When the ratio A by B, if it is a ratio, if it will decline only when the increase in the A component, the numerator, is less than the increase in the denominator, right? Then only the ratio will come down. And that ratio can come down only when you strictly follow the FRBM Act, for a simple reason. There are some concepts of what is called fiscal multiplier. Now, the public debt increases because when there is an increase in the numerator, that means you're actually adding it's through fiscal deficit, right? The fiscal deficit increases, the public debt component also will increase. But if the fiscal deficit increase in fiscal deficit, if it leads to larger increase in GDP growth, then your ratio will actually come down. That's how your ratio comes down. That's what I said. The increase in the numerator is smaller than the increase in the denominator, then you can bring down the public debt from 90% to whatever the target. So for that, the important concept is called fiscal multipliers. Okay. Now, fiscal multipliers is something that unfortunately there was no statistics before 2012 or 13, and this is the first number that we generated in 2012-13, where we found that government capital expenditure multiplier is more than 1. On the other hand, the revenue expenditure is less than 1. Okay, so the capital expenditure multiplier is 2.45. That's what we estimated. And what it means, if you're spending 1 rupee on the public investments, the return on that 1 rupee is going to be 2.45 rupees. That means, in that sense, what happens, your numerator, if it is increasing 1 rupee, the denominator is increasing by 2.45 times. Obviously, the ratio will come down, right? So you are not compressing that. And on the other hand, on the revenue expenditure component, which is transfer payments, subsidies, interest rates, and salaries and wages. So all those things, the multiplier size is less than 1. That means if you are spending 1 rupee on that particular expenditures, the return on that 1 rupee is going to be less than 1 rupee, because there's some kind of a leakage that happens in the economy. And the leakage can be either through increase in inflation or through increasing in the imports. Like those who remember the national income identity, y is equal to c plus g plus x, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. So any decline in the any multiplier which is having less than 1, that means that expenditure is actually leading to larger imports. That is the leakage from the whole identity. So that is another reason why the FRBM Act suggests you have to have expenditure switching from revenue to capital, so that all the ratios will actually come down. So this is for the central government, and in fact, for the capital expenditure, there is an impact multiplier. There is also a cumulative multiplier, and this is not very difficult to understand. If you are using your resources for building roads or infrastructure, the return on that roads and infrastructure is not limited to just for the year, but also for at least for the project period. So there is a positive multiplier generated in such expenditures, not only in the first year but also subsequently for almost 7 years. At an overall macro level, we found that capital expenditure multiplier can be positive for at least 7 years. So the cumulative multiplier for the investment that you made in the year 1 will be totally somewhere close to 4.7. That means if you're spending 1 rupee today, your return on that 1 rupee will be somewhere close to 4.7 rupees. And on the other hand, the revenue expenditure multipliers are almost flat, and you don't get any additional return on the revenue expenditures after the first year. So So this is one thing which has um, which has um, dominated in the recent period, and we are very glad that last two rounds of the central government budget has heavily focused on these numbers. In fact, we have heard 2.45 quoted in many of the press statements, saying that the capital expenditure multipliers are superior compared to revenue expenditure, and that's the reason why last two budgets actually heavily focused on government capital expenditure, not on focusing on kind of a runaway revenue deficits that we have experienced in the post-global financial crisis. But unfortunately, the similar assessments at the state levels are lacking. But aggregate state level, there is some estimates by the RBI, and I just want to tell you that RBI estimates suggest the size of state government multipliers are slightly lower than the central government multipliers. So I think that is an important the estimation, for a simple reason is that there are a lot of mm, general understanding that state governments spend efficiently compared to central government, but I don't think state governments spend more money compared to central government. That is fact. But I think, assuming that state governments spend on an average, maybe some states may be spending much better than the central government, but on an average at the aggregate state level, in fact states multipliers are smaller than central government. These are all empirical. I think anybody can estimate. Again, I keep saying that please don't believe me what I'm saying. You go back to the data, you can estimate. Multiplier is a very simple concept. You can always estimate and see whether what I'm saying is right or wrong. So whatever I'm saying, just don't believe, but you can always try to replicate and see what kind of estimates you get it rather than what I'm saying. Okay. So, in fact, this is another reason why, I had a different take on the 14th Finance Commission recommendations. And again, this is not, you don't believe me, but you can always go back and just check what kind of impact it had. Now, we all know that 14th Finance Commission has suggested a larger devolution to the states, I think 10% more than what the 13th Finance Commission has recommended, as more of an untied grant. But if you look at the studies after studies, since 2015 or 16, every study, most of the studies have suggested that fiscal conditions has deteriorated at the state level even before COVID-19 hit the economies. So I mean, so it's a very counterintuitive for us, especially when the 14th Finance Commission has suggested for a larger devolution. Why does state finances deteriorate? I think that is something which is a very important aspect. And not only the situation has deteriorated, and studies after studies say that post 14 Finance Commission, we see that there is a deterioration in the expenditures on the social sector. Again, it's very counterintuitive, especially when the state governments have been provided with a 10% additional untied grants. Okay, so if that's the case, why should state governments reduce the social sector expenditures? And I think, although I'm not questioning why the 14th Finance Commission increased the devolution, increasing devolution could be for various reasons, and there are many states which could have utilized efficiently, but on an aggregate, on an average, we find that there is a overall deterioration in the state finances post 14th Finance Commission recommendation. In fact, as I discussed in the previous slide, the RBI report says that the size of the multipliers for the state governments are lower than the central government. With the same logic, because of the larger devolution to the states, perhaps we would have lost some GDP growth for a simple reason that states multipliers are lower than the central government. So we have done this study for the 15th Finance Commission. Those who are interested, they can check on the 15th Finance Commission website. And we found what is the net impact of 14th Finance Commission recommendations on the GDP, and we found that on an average, I'm saying for 5 years, we would have lost something like somewhere close to 0.5% of GDP growth, not in level, it's a growth on an average again. So we would have lost GDP because of the 14th Finance Commission recommendation. And I know very clearly, increasing devolution is not certainly meant for increasing the GDP growth, but I think we need to be aware that there is certainly a growth loss because of the increasing devolution. And of course, there are many positives that happened because of the 14th Finance Commission recommendation. But as a students of economics, we need to be very clear. There is nothing emotional here. We need to be very clear that larger devolution to the states need not necessarily lead to larger GDP growth. And so what determines fiscal multiplier? I think that's a completely different question. And in fact, that is the research that I have right now. And again, we students of economics don't really bother what happens to the allocations that happen at the either state government or central government. But I think it's very important for all of us to understand what happens to those resources. I think I have taken a lot of time, but a couple of issues, then I will stop there. There are GST implementation and compensation issues. Again, it has become, although GST has been one of the most important fiscal institution in a federal setup like this, there are a lot of issues in terms of compensation or the 14% minimum guaranteed kind of thing. But I thought, GST had some kind of a birth defect. The 14%, assuring 14% every year, that means you are assuming a constant nominal GDP growth every year. I think that was a wrong, in my view, that was not a great way to start for the GST implementation. By the way, your tax growth or whether it's indirect tax or direct taxes, they're all related to nominal GDP growth. So when you're fixing 14%, every year, that means you're assuming that every year you're going to get a constant nominal GDP growth. If your buoyancy is 1 and you are ensuring that 14% is the GST revenues, that means your nominal GDP growth also need to be 14% every year. So it doesn't happen like that. I thought that was not a great move when we started the GST, and I'm sure now that June 22 onwards, we'll start getting into the discussion. So what would be there should be a continuation of the compensation issues, whether they should have some kind of assured GST resources for the states. So I think these are all going to be a major challenge when the GST Council meets next time. But most importantly, I think what center is doing is also not really right when it comes to introduction of cess and surcharges. Right now, every year it's actually increasing. Right now, some estimates suggest that the cess and surcharges that the government is generating is somewhere close to 15% of gross tax revenue. I think that's something certainly a challenge for the fiscal federalism. But I hope there would be some kind of a relook on this whole cess and surcharges, possibly maybe merging the cess and surcharges to within that the divisible pool would be one way to do it. But I think that will have that needs some kind of discussion. Deterioration in the quality of expenditures. Now, of late, there's a lot of discussion about freebies and all those things. In my view, I think we should not really getting into this debate on the freebies and all those things, for a simple reason that any support mechanism that we provide, until unless we don't have strong institutions, I don't think we should get into that. Even subsidies is not a bad word, but unfortunately what happened is because we had weak institutions, and now subsidy means it has become a very absolutely a negative word in the overall fiscal nomenclature. Now, if the subsidies are presented or delivered properly without any leakage, I'm sure it will have a huge impact on overall aggregate demand. That means there'll be no leakage in the system. So that will have a very huge positive impact on the overall demand. And I think the multiplier also will increase if there are no leakages. So I think we need to ensure the institution. In fact, we have a very strong institutions right now, that Jandan Aadhaar and mobile combination, and which is ensuring reducing, ensuring in you know uh, trying to eliminate the leakages in the way public delivery happens. And there are some kind of excesses that we see right now. The Rajasthan came out with a pension scheme which is going back before to 2004, and I think this generation and the next generation, I think certainly need to oppose this. We have come a long way in the fiscal policy. This has some kind of intra-generational issues. I don't think the government should get into. It looks like we are in a much comfortable in terms of the fiscal. I think that's where the states that have been getting larger untied grants started thinking this kind of policies, which is going to have a huge burden on the next generation. That is one thing which we don't discuss in the fiscal public economics, is that intergenerational policy issues. The policy that Rajasthan bringing up right now will have a huge impact on the future generation. I think that is something that needs to be opposed, irrespective of the party, irrespective of the governments. I think this kind of policies will actually reverse the kind of gains that we had in the last 2 decades in terms of improving the fiscal situation of the states and the central government. So, and Andhra Pradesh, in fact, the kind of the kind of policy, the kind of what you call developmental policies, I think they already made the state exchequer, bankrupt in a way. They're struggling to really pay the salaries. I think so. See, we need to really keep an eye on some of the states which are getting into, in terms of excesses, in terms of fiscal policy, and I think it will have. I was writing somewhere that Rajasthan, the policy and subsequent demand from other states like Gujarat and I think Himachal. I think we are starting another cycle where we are trying to race to the bottom. In a sense, we are going to face some kind of fiscal challenges if every state gets into this kind of a policy mode. So it's a caution, and I think the better sense prevail on policymakers not to reverse the gains that we had in the last 2 decades. So I think I already spoke about it. Union budget proposals, quality of expenditure. This is one reason why everybody has appreciated the kind of policy focus that they had in the last 2 budgets. But I think for the students of economics, even for us, I think what is important right now is not about expenditure, allocations and all those things. What is happening to the public expenditure efficiency? I think the 15th Finance Commission was supposed to bring it as part of the devolution package, but unfortunately, because of the COVID-19, they did not really bite the bullet. But we did some study on assessing the public expenditure efficiency at the state level and also at the sectoral level. I think that needs to be the focus right now, not just talking about only allocations. That is one grudge I have with my profession, that we are all the time we keep criticizing that governments have not allocated money to this or that. But I think whatever the allocated money, how it is being spent is something that as a citizen, and if not as an economist, I think we need to really ensure the better returns for the allocation that they're made. So then I think the RBI interest rate policies, why I brought here is again, there is some kind of apprehension that RBI was hesitant to increase the interest rate because the governments have to finance the interest cost. For students, again, I want to give one small indicator, one simple, very small information. If you see the 2022-23 budget proposal, and if you look at the interest component part of it, if I remember correctly, between 2021 and 22 and 22 and 23, the interest payment component has actually increased by 4 lakh crore. Okay. I'm not talking about 1 or 2 lakh crore. It's 4 lakh crore. Interest payment has increased by 4 lakh crore between 2021-22 and 22-23. And this only for the central government, leave alone other states. So imagine the 4 lakh crore additional taxes need to be mobilized to pay for the interest those who are holding the government securities. I think that's the reason I keep bringing back my concern on public debt to GDP more than the GDP or the fiscal deficit. So the inflation targeting that a lot of people are discussing, I mean, I'll skip that part. The public debt to GDP ratio, what is the optimal public debt to GDP ratio for this country? There are many people who are keep on saying that why should there be limit on public debt to GDP ratio? I think I will not get into discussion with them because um, I mean, whatever I learned certainly say that there is a limit on public debt to GDP ratio because the next generation has to finance it. I think that needs to be the focus. So with that, I would like to stop here because I already spoke about whether India is staring at stagflation. I already spoke about that, but otherwise, I just wanted to caution and again, in a macro fiscal framework, one indicator you should look at is public debt. And I request all the students to go back and look at what is this public debt, what kind of definitions are there in this country, and what is the public debt of Kerala economy. Look at what is the public debt of all India, and I think, and then also look at what is the interest payment that we do for the kind of public debt that we are holding. So these are the issues I request all of you to have a look at, so that you know what is the concern that I'm trying to raise here. So with that, let me stop here and over to Professor Harikuma. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, sir. We are audible.
Yeah. So what next, Dr. Santosh?
Harikuma, sir. 1 second.
I think he is muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So you have touched almost all issues in macro physical issues in India, especially during the post COVID period, and you have also indicated that there is some kind of possibility of a revival in. However, the issues of targeting inflation and getting a higher growth rate are there in it. And thank you very much for sharing your views. As you indicated, that it is something different from all other discussion. So now we will open it for questions and also comments from the participants.